a 126-year span of pure torture and abuse, and for generations to come were affected by this. These people that were on Canada's land first had now been called a doorstop to the economy, and was all caused by the implementation of residential schools. From the early 1870s to 1996, here today, we honor those who died and those who survived residential school.
What really happened during that span? What was it like? How did it start? There are so many questions to be answered, and today we are here to answer all those boiling questions that could change people's opinions on Canada forever. Today, we will expose the truth about residential schools. Torture to over 122,000 kids is not a normal thing. Murder of 50,000 kids is also not a normal thing. It's not just cultural genocide. All of this had a purpose.
Enter St. Mary's IRS, a residential school of pure cruelty and torture. The things they did to the Indigenous kids were inhuman. Some of them can't even be talked about because they aren't school appropriate. That is exactly how bad it was. St. Mary's Mission IRS opened in 1863 and closed in 1985. It was BC's longest running residential school, as well as the last to close down in BC. It ran for a grand total of 122 years. It had originally been a small residential school for boys. Later, another school went by the same name and opened for girls in 1868.
This school was built on the Stolo territory, who had already been through so much, and then this came along. It was originally opened and ran by the Roman Catholic Church of Canada, but then overtaken by the Canadian government as soon as the girls' school opened in 1868. The Stolo people had traces dating back 8 to 10,000 years ago, meaning they have been living on this territory that we proudly call Canada for a very long time. They are a group of First Nations people inhabiting the Fraser Valley and Lower Frazee Canyon of British Columbia, Canada. Stolo is the Halkomelem word for river.
The Stolo are the river people. When the Europeans came in contact with the Stolo people, they decided to carry out a genocide for their own by spreading disease such as smallpox. The Stolos then lost control of their land, and then this residential school came along. Approximately 2,000 children attended the schools while they were in operation, most of them Stolo, many of whom reported experiences that were abusive. However, despite the numerous personal accounts of students who suffered abuse at the school, there is no acknowledgement of this on any of the plaques at the site. It operated quite near the Fraser River for nearly 2 decades.
They later moved further uphill in 1882 to make room for the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR. The boys were kept separately. Both of them had completely separate dormitories. The girls' residence also housing the nuns' quarters, an infirmary, place for the ill, recreation room, and chapel.
Parents that were able to visit were allowed to meet their child. Many parents camped around the school so they could meet their children. The parent had to go through a lot of struggle to meet their children. They never wanted to go a whole year without their children. The government purposely put residential schools far away from their parents' homes so that the parents could barely ever meet their child. This would also have a huge mental effect on the child's brain and would probably fail to remember all the culture they had been taught.
The conditions at St. Mary's Mission IRS were just like any other residential school's condition. They were harsh and abusive. Some of the conditions included if you were speaking your tongue, native tongue, and you did get caught, you would be abused. If you did not obey the nuns, you would also be abused. Harsh terms that the nuns and teachers used at this school included rub the brown off your skin. Very harsh and abusive things to say to a kid. These poor innocent kids had to go through so much more during the span of these residential schools.
There isn't a particular number of the number of victims of this residential school. but there is a cemetery right next to the school. That's a bit shady. The cemetery's name is the OMI Cemetery, which also stands for Oblates of Mary Immaculate Cemetery. This won't disclose the number of bodies buried, but this is the info we have. Although it is a proven fact that almost 50% of kids died at each residential school. This probably means that over 5,000 kids for sure died.
The grounds of the Catholic Mission School are now a part of Fraser River Heritage Park, as the school itself has been destroyed. A new bell tower was constructed in 2000 and houses the original 1875 bell from the mission. In 2001, the Mission Indian Friendship Center provided funds to build a covered picnic shelter in the park. The park is also home to the OMI Cemetery, where priests, nuns, and students of the mission school were buried. Residential schools were the worst place on earth for these helpless indigenous kids. Many of them tried to escape, but all were unsuccessful. Residential schools were so bad that the UN listed these events as a genocide.
The Canadian government apologized 20 years later after the last school closed, but it wasn't enough to compensate for all the Indigenous had to go through. These residential schools are a big part of Canadian history and will always be remembered negatively.